So without further ado, I invite Pak Wisnu Setiadi Nugroho, SIMSc PhD, to take the stage. Please join me in giving him a warm round of applause as we begin our seminar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessita. Make my job actually a lot easier. Summarizing and discussing like what we're gonna talk about today in this morning. So, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming during this summer break. Today we're gonna discuss about social protection in developing countries. We are like honored to have Professor Rima here to come to Yogyakarta with her busy schedules and everything. So. I was like promoting to my student, you should come because like this is like maybe once in a lifetime, something like that. So thanks so much like people that coming here. So I think without further ado, I think we just like give the room and then time to Professor Rima to discuss her presentations today, and then we can like have a discussion, question and answer after that. So Prof. Rima, the time and room for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much for having me here today. It really is a pleasure, and it's a pleasure to be able to give the talk I'm giving today, where rather than delving into one paper or one study, I'm having an opportunity to share several different papers and what we learned from the big picture and how they fit together as we're trying to think about social assistance programs. I think this is very important to do. Part of why we do this research and we do the studies is because we want to contribute to a broader set of knowledge that can have impact. And so for me, being able to try to be here today with all of you to put it together and think it through, I think is actually very important. And it is very exciting because as I'm going to talk about in a moment, many countries around the world have similar systems in place of social assistance as Indonesia. And the types of the challenges we're going to be talking about and the potential solutions is something that looks very similar in a lot of different countries. I mean, there's differences in context and such, but structures are very similar. And what's very exciting about this work is that the work that is being done in Indonesia, joint with many different partners from TNP2K, from Bappenas, the Ministry of Social Affairs, and others coming together. It brings a lot of learning for Indonesia, but I think also helps inform many other countries around the world that are having these kind of issues. So it's nice, and it's nice that we should all feel proud of the fact that this kind of work is being done here. At least I feel very proud to have been part of it. So let me jump in and let's see if I manage. Oh no, wait, I didn't manage to do it. Is it? Oh, oops. Oh, I jumped ahead. Wait. Oh wait, is it? There it is. Okay. So today I'm going to be talking about. Let me just check. Okay. Today I'm going to be talking about social protection in a lot of low and middle income countries. And as I said, today is really thinking through the evidence of what we've learned from Indonesia. Did I do that? No? I don't think it's... Oops. Okay. Wait, something, okay. Yeah. Oh, maybe we could go back one more slide. Yeah. Thanks. Oh, thank you. Okay. Sorry. No. I know technology, and I'm very bad with the technology too. So today we're going to be talking really about social assistance programs. And I think this is actually, for me, a very good time to take a step back and think about these issues, given the last couple of years with the COVID-19 crisis. Oh wait, I don't think mine is working. Can you just say next? Oh, next slide. Thank you. Let's do that. Perfect. Thank you. So COVID-19 was a very, very big shock to livelihoods. And it was a big macro shock to many people all at once And to different people than who had been affected by poverty before, were now having their livelihoods affected, health affected, and so forth. One of the biggest responses to try to address these issues and increase vulnerability, increase poverty in many countries around the world was to rapidly increase social protection. And this is the case everywhere. So this was the case where I live in the US. This was the case here in Indonesia. And so, as you can see, the World Bank has estimated that without this increase in social protection, without the fiscal response, poverty would have been 2.4 percentage points higher during the pandemic. So this response was extremely, extremely important. But one thing to note is that the response was a lot higher in high-income countries than low and middle-income countries in terms of a percentage of GDP. And so in that sense, the effects on poverty, the effects on inequality, all these good effects of social protection were actually lower in lower and middle income countries, in part due to the lower financial response. And so trying to think about two aspects of how we can think about what is the right level of social protection, how do we think about designing these kind of social protection programs, not just we know COVID-19 is hopefully a once in a lifetime kind of shock, but in response to more every shocks that we have to the economy overall, more regularly, how can we think about designing these programs better? So next slide. Now, this pattern of seeing that high-income countries spending more on social protection in the pandemic happens in normal times too. So over the many, many, many years, social protection spending as a percentage of GDP has been rising considerably in lower and middle-income countries, and particularly within the middle-income countries like Indonesia. And it's now, these safety net programs are covering 2.5 billion people worldwide. But at the same time, many are left behind given the spending levels. And then there's this other issue that it's often, these are very, running large-scale government programs to address poverty is very challenging in many countries. And the challenges are particularly pronounced in lower and middle income countries, as I'm going to be talking about, where the institutions might not be, the institutional capacity might not be as strong, but also the way labor markets tend to be more, there's much more informality in the labor markets, there's less information about people, and so forth. And so it's the same kind of challenges you see in the higher income countries, but they're just much more pronounced in the lower and middle income countries. Next slide. So the question is, at the end of the day, what do we want to do with social assistance? We want to help people, right? That's our goal. We know that there are some people who are systematically poor, and we want to make sure they get assistance. We know there are other people who might be doing okay, but they had a bad shock. There was a health shock to the family. Somebody lost their job and they need some help while they're looking for a new one. At the end of the day, we really want to help people. So one of the biggest challenges is, how do you find the right people to help? Now, when I said before that these challenges are very similar in high-income countries, but they're more pronounced in lower and middle-income countries, let me give you one example. So for example, in the US, when you want to find somebody who needs social assistance, what do? Well, first of all, other than a very small, the informality is very, very tiny in the US. Most people are, when they are employed, they're employed in a formal job. So what does that mean? That there's a paper trail of how much money that person is earning. There's a paper trail of, if I've lost my job, there's a document and a record that I've lost my job and I need assistance. And in fact, actually a lot, if you want to show, for example, for food stamps, you want to show that you don't have that much assets, that you need help, you can show your bank account statements, and that can be verified. And in fact, many, the social assistance programs also run through the tax system. So the tax, most everybody, again, most people are registered through the tax system, even if they don't need to pay. But then you know their income levels through the tax system, and there's all these records that go through it. And for example, that is how the Earned Income Tax Credit provides funding to low-income households in the US, is all through the tax system. Now, in low and middle income countries, there's a huge challenge because most of the people you'd want to help are engaged in informal labor markets. That the tax system, the net of the tax system is also very low. Most people are not registered. I think in Indonesia, the numbers I've seen is about 11% of people are registered in the tax system. So you can't use that. That's not the right set of people. The banking institutions, to get many people are banked, but many of the people that you'd actually want to help don't have savings accounts. They don't have their assets in the bank system. So using the bank system to also verify assets is very challenging. So that means that you have to you can't use the same methodologies used in high-income countries to actually find the right people and provide social assistance. You need to do alternative systems based on the context and based on the structure of information in the market. So that's one challenge. There's a second challenge, is how do you deliver it? Like once you find the right person, how do you deliver social assistance to that person? Now again, the challenges are going to be different. In a lot of high-income countries, the social assistance is it's done through the banking system. So you get, for example, for food stamps, you get a debit card that you can use. You can do bank transfers. If somebody lost their job, they get unemployment insurance, you do a bank transfer into their bank account, and it's all verified. And that is slowly changing and happening in middle-income countries, moving to that kind of banking system. But it really comes back to this issue that once you find the right people, what are the effective mechanisms that can make sure that they actually get the help they need? And again, it's going to have to be different, and the way we design these programs have to be different due to the institutional structures. Okay, next slide. Okay, so way back in the past, it was really hard, and many countries around the world didn't try. And in fact, what you saw in most countries around the world is that you'd offer blanket subsidies. And by blanket subsidies, I mean everybody gets access to it, and it's usually a subsidy. Oftentimes it's a commodity subsidy. So for example, in a lot of countries, people will subsidize bread, like the flour into bread. In many other countries, energy is subsidized. So the gas you get at the gas station is subsidized. And these subsidies, the idea is that you don't have to then look for who to find, and you're finding simple ways, delivery mechanisms to get it to everybody. You get your gas you go to the gas station to get gas, and the subsidy is built in. So it tries to cut down on the delivery challenges. And you hope that, even though everybody can access it, you're hoping that the poor get more of the subsidy. Next slide. And these subsidies are very common. They're common everywhere. They have a lot of positives. As I said, they provide some social assistance because you're getting access to the subsidy. They tend to be popular because people can see that you're getting the subsidy. And around the world, so for example, in France, they tried to cut the fuel subsidy, and that led to a lot of the yellow jacket protests. So people really like to see the subsidy. It feels tangible. There's a lot of popularity around it. But the challenges are such that they often help the rich as much, if not often more, than the poor. So they tend to be very regressive. And they're also, they tend, because you're giving the subsidy to everybody. I would love it if we could give the subsidy to everybody, but there's limited budgets. And we talked about it before, that in low and middle income countries, the budgets they tend to be lower. And so you end up with a lot of fiscal strain. And then there are distortions. So for example, fuel is often one that is subsidized in many places around the world. And that's, if we're trying to get people to go green, that might not be the right thing to subsidize because we might think there is overuse. And then there are some graphs here that show, just to give a sense of, these are a bit older graphs. But what I find interesting about them is that if you compare a lot of these commodity subsidies, so the fossil fuel subsidies, you're often paying a lot more than you're investing in health in some of the countries that have the fuel subsidy, or you're spending a huge amount more than is being received in foreign aid. And it just tells you the scope of how expensive these tend to be. Next slide. Okay, so I think and this is not a linear movement. It goes back and forth, but a lot of countries are trying to reduce the subsidies and replace them with transfers that are targeted directly to poor households, to do cash transfers or voucher programs or food programs. Although today many countries also provide in-kind subsidies. So a lot of, at least 40 countries have reformed their energy subsidies. At the same time, when you reform the subsidies, you cut the subsidies, what you do is you increase the transfers you give directly to poor households to make up for the fact that they're no longer receiving some of the subsidies. And so you're trying to then think about, can I do a more cost-effective way to transfer more resources to people who really need help? So in Indonesia, which I'm talking about today, some of the work that some of the work I'm talking about today, some of the early papers started when, in 2013, when the fuel price was increased, there was additional bensos given to the poor to make up for it. And some of the expansions and conditional cash transfer programs as well. So today, some of the work I'm going to be talking about was started around this time when there was a move to start to cut the subsidies and to improve the cash transfers, and then all these questions came up about how to design these programs better. And that led to a lot of the research I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, next slide. So as I said, providing targeted transfers creates a new policy challenge. And there's two challenges. There's lots of challenges. These are not easy programs to run, and it's pretty impressive how well they are run, given how hard they are to administer and how difficult conceptually they are. But I'm going to be talking about studies in two big buckets. The first is who is eligible to receive assistance and how do we identify them? And the second is, once you identify a household that needs assistance, how do you make sure that the transfer actually reaches them? Like, how do you make sure they get the help they need? Okay. It's a little weird in economics. People usually ask you questions throughout, so I'm not sure, am I going too fast or am I, okay. Or am I being confusing? Okay. Okay, we go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to start with who is eligible to receive assistance and how do we identify them. Next slide. So as I said, Indonesia, this is over many years, gradually moving away from non-targeted subsidies to targeted transfers. The targeting is done for many different types of programs: subsidized rice, scholarships, health insurance, CCTs, UCTs. Pakilan could probably tell you have a more complete list than I can ever give. But it was also, one of the things that was also important was during the pandemic, there was the targeted programs, but was very interested in the pandemic. It really showed how important the targeting was, because there was a particular need to identify households that were hit by the COVID-19 shock, who were not necessarily the same people who needed social assistance before. So for example, if I was in tourism, maybe before I was earning a very good income and now I'm not, or maybe if I'm a restaurant owner, or, there was a very different type of profile of people being affected, much more urban. The rural households were more spread out, there was maybe less issues. So, there was a lot of different type of people. And so it also was telling you that with these budget constraints, you want to really try to think about how do you find the right person at the right time as well. That it's not just saying we're going to find the poor, because poverty is not a static concept. People might move in and out. How do we find assistance when people really need it? And how do you create these systems that are more flexible? And a lot of the research I'm going to be talking about is trying to think about that. Next slide. Okay. Now, as we talked about, the challenge is information. The challenge is the lack of a paper trail to figure out who needs help. And so what has happened in many countries, including Indonesia, is that governments are moving towards a unified database, where there's a database where different social assistance programs can all access information, and that information can be used to help enroll people in social assistance programs. Now here's the issue. What kind of, there's lots of questions. What type of data should this database include? Who does it include? How do you find the right people to include? What do we do if people are excluded from the database or need to be added? What is the updating mechanism? As we said, poverty is not a static concept. And you want to update it as well. So all of these questions, as I said, these are really, really complex. It sounds simple, like how do we find someone who needs help? But these are actually really complex questions, especially when you're doing it at a large scale, very high stakes. These are people's lives, and all across Indonesia is a very big country. So it is very, very challenging. Okay, next slide. Thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna, there's different methodologies that are used in lower and middle income countries. I'm gonna just try to give the quick overview and then get into the studies. One of the main methodologies is called a proxy means test. So a means test is an income test. Do you have the means or not? And that determines whether or not you get into social assistance programs, for example, in the US. But because we don't have information on income in Indonesia, it's very hard to get, we proxy for it. And so you have to guess through these proxies. And so what ends up happening is that every couple of years, the government does a survey measuring household assets and characteristics. It has a lot of really positive features. It's objective. So there's a clear, transparent mechanism for being on the list, and it's consistent because the rules apply to everybody equally because there's a process in place and there's data. So there's a lot of nice aspects about it. It's not, the cons is that it's not perfect. It might not necessarily, we know that it's a proxy. It's not exact. We know that some people who should be on the list are not on the list and vice versa. And also there are aspects of it that are not transparent. In the sense that it's transparent if you understand the statistics and the data collection, but it could be challenging to understand in practice if you're not familiar with statistics and the prediction methodologies. It could feel very overwhelming and not transparent. So pros and cons. Okay. Another methodology is community-based targeting. Community members can identify people. And we see this in government programs, but we often see this in private philanthropy as well. So for example, if you look at a lot of religious institutions, churches and mosques, people come together as a community and they think about, is there someone in our community who needs help, and they provide assistance. So it's trying to take that flavor and bring it into the more public space of using information from the community. And it has a pro in that the community might know who actually needs help. So they might know who recently lost their job, or there's someone maybe it looks like they have they have a decent house, but somebody in the household is sick, and that house, that's not captured in the data, but that household needs assistance. Now, but there's also cons as well. Maybe the community is not reliable. Do they choose people they like? Do they exclude people that they think are, that guy is very mean, so let's see, they may need help, but let's not put them on the list. There's all these, complexities in the way communities operate. And there's a worry as well that if there's local leaders in charge of the process, will they give it to people that are their relatives or their friends, and will that process get captured? And that's a concern because you want it to be open and fair for everybody. Okay. And the third type of methodology is called self-targeting. Now, in a way, this is used in many countries. So for example, to give an example from the US as well, our unemployment insurance program is self-targeted. You lose your job, you go to the government and you apply for unemployment insurance, and then you bring the paperwork to show that you are eligible. Now, this is, it's a system that could work because you know if you need help. And so maybe you know better than anyone else if you're having challenges. Now, but then there's, again, pros and cons. The pros is, if you're missed by the system, you can go and you can get assistance, you can apply on your own. And it might be that the rich people don't bother to apply because they know it's for the poor. And so then you save errors of rich people being accidentally included or the cost of having to screen them out, because it's all about trying to get people who need assistance to apply. But then could be cons as well. People might not know about the program. And you often worry that the people who are most vulnerable may not necessarily get access to information as easily. And so they might not know they can apply, even though they are the most vulnerable. And so you're worried that the most vulnerable can be screened out. The other issue is that if I'm already vulnerable, maybe I'm afraid to go to the government and apply. I could be intimidated. It's, for me, I was trying to change my voter. I had moved a couple years ago, and I needed to change where I was voting. I have a PhD, I'm a professor, and it's still very intimidating going into the government and doing all the paperwork. And so it's, you could also imagine somebody lower education, more vulnerable, that, it could be intimidating to go apply. And so this is why we want to study and understand, are these things, is the pros more than the cons? Which methodologies have more pros and cons, and how can you use the methodologies together to try to make the system work best? Okay, next slide. Oh, what time do I have till? Sorry, till. Oh, perfect. I have plenty of time. Okay, I have lots of time. Okay. Okay, so we wanted to, over time, we started evaluating these different methods through a series of studies. And in fact, actually, the study one is going to be looking at the proxy means test versus community targeting. Study two is going to be looking at the sort of automatic enrollment based on your proxy means test versus self-selection verified by a PMT. Now, and again, as I said, study one is a bit older. It was around the time of the thinking about the fuel subsidy changes in 2013. It was before then, trying to inform some of the policies around then. So the next slide. Okay. So the first study was done trying to understand which method worked best, the proxy means test, or a community, or a hybrid method. Given the time, I'm not going to really talk about the hybrid as much. But is what? Sorry. Oh. Did I get something wrong? Oh. Okay. You should correct me if I get something wrong. Come on, Pakilan. Okay. So the study was done in about 640 villages. And what was done is a little transfer program was set up for the study, and households were assigned to one of the three approaches. And the reason why we randomized it is that let's say some studies chose to do community targeting. Well, maybe they chose to do community targeting because they know they would be good at it, but it wouldn't work in the ones that didn't choose it. So we can't really have a good comparison comparing those that chose it versus those that didn't. So we randomized the methodology. So some by a lottery, some got the proxy means test, some got the community method, and some got the hybrid. And there's, at the time, the proxy means test had about 49 indicators. The government went door to door to collect information on assets, education, occupation, and then used it to create a prediction score. And those at the bottom of the prediction score, who were seen to be the lowest income, get the program. Oh. Then there is a community targeting method, where a community facilitator goes in and explains the program, and communities come together and they rank everybody in the village. And they say these are to try to figure out what is the income distribution and who is going to need assistance in the village. And then the hybrid methodology was kind of combining the two. Next slide. Oh, next slide. Yeah, okay. So I must say, as a side note, when this started, I was very skeptical of the community methodology. And this is where the experimental approach can really surprise us and change our minds very much. Because I was really worried there would be a lot of capture by local village leaders and local elites. But then what did the results look like? So first of all, the PMT, so using the data-driven approach, had slightly lower targeting error. But it was also interesting when you're looking at per capita consumption. So when you're trying to guess at, which we use as a proxy for income as well. But first of all, the differences were, they were both very similar at finding the poorest of the poor. The differences were around the border, around the cutoff. And so it was the richer of the poor where the methodologies were finding different effects. And what was interesting is that if you looked at the community methodology compared to the proxy means test, the community methodology was much better at getting my own opinion of my income status. And so there were differences between the two. And then when you looked at the community methodology versus the proxy means test, the community methodology was also better. It was not better, it was different in terms of the people it chose. The proxy means test was designed to get at per capita consumption. But the community had different, like a more holistic approach to what poverty was. So to give an example, if you had two families that were roughly the same per capita consumption, the communities would choose the one where it was a widow who was leading the household, given that that household had maybe additional different types of vulnerabilities. So it wasn't that, even though they were slightly different in terms of per capita consumption, maybe these differences were stemming from a different conception of what poverty is beyond basic per capita consumption. And so if you go to the next slide, thank you, yes. What you actually saw was, because of this, it turns out that the community, when you use the community targeting, it actually had higher legitimacy within the community than the PMT. Even in reality, they probably weren't completely different. The errors weren't that different. They were choosing slightly different people. They weren't hugely different. But the communities felt much more legitimacy because they were part of the process, and it included their conception of what poverty was in their own communities. And I think this is very important. You know, for the graphs, it's saying the number, they were less likely to say poor households were missed. They were less complaints about the process. And, you know, this is very important because for these programs to be successful, you want legitimacy of the program. You want trust in the program. And so the fact that being part of the process gives you some trust is actually very important. Okay, next slide. Okay. So during, so to note that, you know, during the COVID-19 crisis, using the Dana DESA, community targeting was used to allocate additional transfers to households that were not already in the social assistance. So it was used as a very flexible methodology to get at additional people who needed help during the crisis. And I must say, in some work that I'm currently now doing with Pakilan, we're trying to analyze the properties of the program, and I can tell you some of the preliminary results show that this was actually very successful in meeting its goal of trying to find people who are missing from the list, who are newly vulnerable due to COVID-19, and actually providing social assistance. So hopefully the next time you invite me at UGM, I could present those results. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the second study is the on-demand application, and whether or not, how this compares to an automatic enrollment. So what do I mean? So even if you apply for the program, there's some sort of verification in place. So for example, in the US, when you apply to the unemployment insurance program, you apply and you show that you've lost your job and you are now vulnerable and you need help. So what we did is we compared two systems. One, which is a system where the government goes door to door and collects the proxy means test, so all the data used to do the predictions on poverty, versus if people apply, but that same data collection exercise is done then to check to verify whether or not people are actually in need of assistance. And it's advertised that you're going to be verified, so that people, with the idea that people who know that they are not actually eligible won't show up. Okay, so what do we? So this research took place in the expansion of Indonesia's CCT program PKH. As it was expanded to new areas to do the targeting there. We could do the next. Okay. So again, a randomized evaluation was done because if communities chose one method or the other method on their own, it might be for particular reasons. And so if you wanted to just say what would happen if you made this a nationwide policy, how does it affect all villages equally, you really want to make sure that you have a good comparison group. So half the villages through a lottery were assigned to the PMT with the automatic enrollment, where you go door to door, it's status quo, and then the other half were assigned to the self-targeting group. Okay, so the next slide. Okay. So it was actually, the results were very intriguing, and at least, again, for me, this is where the data speaks to you. And you can learn a lot of things from the data about how these things operate. And so there were two key results. One of them I thought would happen, and one of them I was surprised by. So the one that I thought could happen is that rich people did not come. So the eligibility that you're going to be verified was advertised. So richer people did not show up. What did this mean? Is that the proxy mean test has error. So sometimes rich people get included when they shouldn't be because of the statistical properties. But if they don't come, they're not included. And so you actually save a lot of money for the program by them not coming. And so that's the one that I thought would happen. But it was very clear that that was happening, and you can see it in the data. The one that very much surprised me was actually that under the application system, the poorest households were more than twice as likely to receive benefits in the self-targeting villages. Now that's surprising because one is automatic enrollment. You go door to door and you find everybody and you give it to those who need help. The other one is, if you're poor, you have to apply. But what we saw, what was actually happening is that in the automatic enrollment, people were getting missed by the surveyors. Not everybody was gone door to door. How they found people to interview was not fully happening. But then in the self-application program, people were able to apply. And so it was actually, again, this is the result that really surprised me because I really thought, oh, if you're vulnerable, you're not going to want to go to the office and apply. You're not going to hear about the program. But it actually increased your chances to actually get the program. Again, I think this is why we do research, to get surprised and to learn new things that are useful in terms of how we think about policy. Okay, so next slide. Okay, so, oh yeah, I'm gonna totally have enough time. Okay, so I'm always worried. I never quite know if I get the timing right. Okay, so the first two studies I talked about, and there are others as well that have been done, but really just to give you a flavor of, it's actually very challenging to figure out who needs help. And it's very challenging, it is just very challenging because of the informational constraints. There's information constraints on basically my current income today. And even if you go and you try to collect everybody's information at one point in time, how do you know you have the right information a year or two from now as things happen? And so really the first set of research was to say, what are the methodologies that we can use? Let's learn about their strengths and weaknesses and think about how we could put it together to have a system that's more flexible and can work better for vulnerable households. The second set of research that I'm going to discuss is then how do you ensure that once you find the right people, that they actually get what they're supposed to receive. And this is very challenging. We see this all the time in many countries in the world, including in the US, including in Europe, that the take-up of these programs is often incomplete, that not everybody who's eligible receives them, and there are leakages in the system where money goes missing, and this happens everywhere. And so there were two studies that that I'm going to be talking about that really say that when you have limited budgets and you want to make sure that your full budget is being used really well to make sure that the people who need help, are there things you could do, changes you can make to the program to make it more effective? So it's not, and I think there's two studies I want to talk about. One, which is about increasing transparency in the programs, and one which is changing what you give in the program, and how both of them can make a huge difference. So the first is, if we go to the next slide. Okay, sorry, I'm just gonna. Okay, so the first is, it's really trying to understand this question of, can transparency improve program delivery, but also, and what I think is very important here is by how much. If there is a transparency effect, maybe we think that there is going to be a transparency effect. Is it small? Is it large? How do you design transparency in a way that has the biggest effect? And so when we think about it from an economics theory point of view, we think that transparency, if you let citizens know more information about the program, they can increase their bargaining power, and they can demand better services. And it'll really allow them to monitor service providers and so forth, and really address political economy concerns. So many years ago, now I feel very old. We studied these questions in Indonesia in the Raskin program, where from the initial baseline data, the poorest 30% of households, so the poorest 30% of households were at the time entitled to receive 15 kg of rice per month at a fifth of the market price, but there were substantial leakages. And in fact, many people who were not eligible for the program got the program, which meant that if you were a poor household, you got actually a very little food allocation. And given a lot of the issues in Indonesia, around poverty at the very, very bottom, about stunting, part of the reason why we're having these programs is that we want to make sure households have enough to eat. And so if you go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Sorry, thank you. So what we did is there was a proposal in place to introduce ID cards for eligible households to explain how citizens can access the subsidized rice program, how they can access Raskin. And the cards, in some ways, the cards had two purposes. One, it first told you that you are indeed eligible, because you're now getting a card, and now you know for sure that you are indeed eligible. So first, that's a very important piece of information. The second aspect of the card is that they gave you information about what you're eligible for. So it's a second piece of information. And so what we did is we also tested variations of this to try to understand there's different ways you could give out a card. Again, a card seems very simple. You send out a card, but what you put on the card matters. It can matter. And so we tested, for example, different variations of what information was put on the card. We also, might matter is whether or not you received the card. So one hypothesis we had was that, the cards are going through the local mail system, being mailed directly to citizens. And so it could be that the card never arrives to you. And in fact, we did see this when we were running the study, that oftentimes the card wouldn't arrive to you. And so what we did is we did two things. One, we tested no card. We tested getting a card. And then we tested getting a card plus additional information in the villages about who should be getting their card. So you see in the picture here, here's a list of that was posted in certain villages that the cards are coming and that you're eligible to get your card, so make sure you go get your card when the mail is coming. Okay, so again, we did this as an RCT with these different treatments in place. And I'm not going to be able to get a chance to give all the results, but just I wanted to give a few. So if we go to the next slide, thank you. Okay, so first of all, the cards increased the subsidies eligible families received by about 26%. So they were a cost-effective tool to increase the amount that poor families were receiving underneath the program, which is pretty amazing. But as I said, what we had started hearing a lot was that the cards were effective, but not everybody was receiving their cards. Oftentimes, we would do qualitative field visits, and we would show up to a village, and there's a box of cards sitting in the local leaders on their shelf. Or the cards never made it, and they got mailed back to Jakarta. So the second treatment was designed to really tell people cards are coming. So if you look at, if we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. The publicizing the beneficiary less increased the subsidy even more. So the information that the cards were coming was really, really important in terms of two things: people receiving their cards, but then also the amount of subsidy that they received. And so here you're comparing just cards versus cards plus public information, and you see that the cards plus the public information is higher. So if we go to the next slide. So what was really interesting is that then the government ended up scaling up the cards across Indonesia with the KPS cards. But what I find really fascinating was this. At the time, the original plan was that the cards were getting mailed out and there was an increase in transparency. But what we had seen in the study was that the increased publicity really, really mattered. And otherwise, people wouldn't get their cards. So when the cards were mailed out, this was accompanied by a very, very large public information campaign. Find out if you're eligible to receive your card. And the huge information campaign with TV ads, radio ads, it looked different than the study where we hung up the list of who was eligible, but it was the same idea, that really trying to inform people that the cards were coming and you're going to get information and you can use your cards. When we looked in the Susanas data afterwards, after the KPS cards were mailed out, most people got their cards, whereas in the study, a lot of people did not get their cards. The public information campaign around it worked, which means that it's probably many more people were benefiting during the scale-up than they did during the study. And it really just tells you, again, how you go from the study and the knowledge you gain and the information to trying to think about how you can design programs better. It might not be exactly the same way as in the study, but you use that knowledge to design them better to really try to make an impact. And again, for me, this is, there's so many different people and ministries and everyone involved in the study and all of this, and I'm very grateful to have been a part of it. But again, it also speaks to the fact that we often think policy and programs, they seem so simple, you mail out a card, but there's actually a lot of thought about the design of these things that really make a huge difference in terms of how effective they are. Okay, so next slide. Okay. So the next study, this is joined again with a number of people, including Pakilan, is another project that to be honest, I am very humbled to have been a part of. The Indonesia launched a large-scale reform several years ago, changing the Raskin program, which gave out subsidized rice, and by that time it was free rice to the poor, to a voucher system. So it's a digital voucher redeemable for rice or eggs at private agents throughout the country. Now this is really important because many countries right now, I often get this question, even on a call yesterday with an international organization. They were talking about another country that is going through this kind of change, moving from giving in-kind food transfers to giving subsidies, but there isn't a huge amount of evidence on it, and so this Indonesia study is actually very important because it gives really helps us understand the impact of these programs, these policy reforms. Now this was a huge undertaking where it was really randomization at scale. It was a randomized experiment to understand the switch. But what was very interesting about it is it was built into the design of the program. So the move from going from Raskin to the voucher program was going to happen over a number of years. For the first year, the government chose 66 cities that they would do the reform in. And then after that, it was going to be gradual over time. And they had to pick the districts. So for the 2018-2019, there were about 105 districts that were eligible to be part of that next phase. Some would be done in 2018, some would be done in 2019. How do you choose? And so what was done is that it was just a lottery. So some, by some code and stata, determined which ones got in 2018 and which ones got in 2019. And then because of that randomization in place, we could use that to evaluate what is the impact of the reform. And it was very, the other thing to note, if you go to the next slide, these is, okay, so the map of Indonesia, the blue is the districts that were treated in 2018. The orange is the districts that were treated in 2019. So what's nice about this is it really tells you, because it was spread out across Indonesia, minus some of the eastern part, but like it was pretty spread out. It tells you something about external validity. What happens if you do this reform in different across the country? But it poses this other challenge. Another key challenge is that you needed representative data that was representative at the district across all these districts across the country to evaluate it. Now, if I went and I tried to collect this survey data on my own, it would have been impossible. It would have been impossible, and it would have been expensive and so hard to do. But with TNP2K, Bapanas, and MOSA, we partnered with BPS to use the Susanas data, which is representative at the district level, in order to evaluate the program. Okay, so we go to the next slide. So just to give you a sense of the results, now much more of the subsidy, just by going from the in-kind, just handing out rice, to giving people a voucher, much more of the subsidy went to the poor. Now, why was that the case? When I went to go pick up my rice, I didn't, sometimes I wouldn't get it because they'd run out of rice. Sometimes I would get only a partial amount of rice. But when I had the money that was put onto the debit card, and I went to go, and the full amount of money is put onto the debit card, I got my full allotment. And once I got the debit card, I would get my full allotment each month. And so it really just concentrated the assistance to poor households. Now also, I should note, because of the scale of the study, one of the things that we could do is actually look at impacts on poverty. And so if you go to the next slide, it actually had a pretty big effect. For the households that are very, very at the bottom of the income distribution, so those below PMT score of 15, 10, 5, the effects were really large because it's a big part of their income to get more of the social assistance. And so you see at the bottom 15%, you see a pretty big reduction in poverty using the consumption data from the Susanas, which is, again, pretty amazing. When you think about it, is you're taking these programs, it's the same amount of money for the program. So with the same amount of money, you can have a much bigger impact on poverty just by the program design. And that's a very, very, very powerful thought, and that's why we do these studies, and that's why we try to think very hard about policy design, is because we're just trying to do the best we can given the resources available. Next slide. Okay, Go to the next slide. So, for me, this is, it's, why do we do this research? Part of, we do this research, we publish research. We're all, but we do it for more than that. We do it because we want to try to think about how we can inform the world a little bit better. We want to learn. The research is helping us learn and try to think, can we all do a little bit better? And for me, I've always been interested in these issues of social assistance and social insurance and social protection. But the COVID-19 crisis to me also really highlighted how important it is, but then also the challenges. All these issues that we talk about trying to introduce more flexibility and making sure delivery mechanisms work. The countries that did better in the pandemic were the countries that had more flexible social protection systems, spent more on social protection, and had better delivery mechanism and institutions in place that they could react quickly to try to minimize effects on the poor. And so, we really understand how this research can inform that. Was very, very important to me. And again, I hope some ideas that I hope that the talk gave is that, there's two lessons for me from the research that I presented today, is that one, the data-driven systems are very important in terms of targeting and finding households, but it's important to bring in soft information too. That this soft information actually can help minimize error and create more legitimacy in ways that are very important. And it's something as we're designing systems that bringing in that human element, especially as the world is moving more towards data and AI and all these other things, we can't forget the human element. The second one is that we talk about improving governance and monitoring, but sometimes it's just these changes in the way we structure programs, increasing transparency a bit, changing the nature of the subsidy can actually have really large effects. And so it's not just about monitoring more, but it's really thinking hard about how we design the programs and making them better for the people who are ultimately are the people who we want to make sure that they're getting the help that they need. Okay, and so that was my talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Rima. Actually, I get text from someone that complaining that I didn't introduce Prof. Rima.
Oh.
But I think like Prof. Rima is like a Coldplay in academic, right? Everybody know and then everybody loves. So no need further introductions. And then like a lot of your papers actually we discussed in the classroom. I think some of my students is here, and then like in the classroom, I promised Prof. Rima gonna be here, and then she is here. So please enjoy while she is being here. So if I can summarize a little bit before the Q&A, like Prof. Rima emphasized that there is like a research on policy design because it's gonna be affect a lot. Especially like for Indonesia has a limited resource and a lot of a very very big country. So if you can do research, especially like students, especially like for the professors that improve the policy design in three aspects. I make a note in three aspects in poverty, targeting, amount or like how you give the a subsidy, and then the last one is about transparency. It's gonna be like improve and give like a beneficial for our country as well. So we're gonna head up to the Q&A session. So if you have a questions, I think like there's a lot of chat box. We have like 153 Prof. Rima in the Zoom. So it's quite big forum, like a Coldplay, always like sold out. So if you have a question, please raise your hand or like in the forum here or like in the Zoom. Please, if somebody want to have questions. How about in the Zoom, Tony? Is there any like questions in the Zoom? Oh, you send it to me? Wait, mana Ton? Okay. Oh. All right, so we have a question from whom? Kisha. Yeah, okay. Kisha is one of our professor as well. Bu Kisha is thank you for the presentations, remarkable presentation. Us too. Following the discussion regarding informal workers in Indonesia, there's still missing social protections for them. And we know that informal workers are often, not always, or maybe not always, more vulnerable than the formal workers. So the question is, why is the government or policymakers hesitant to widen the social protections for informal workers? at least based on her experience. She's on labor with ILO, so maybe she know. And then also part the argument maybe because they're afraid to promote informality, so government may be afraid like keep the worker in the informal. They want to go to formal sectors, or maybe there is a other reason. So the question is like whether you have any evidence for Indonesia that widening social protections in informal worker will or will not promote informality. So
No,
I think it's on.
is it on?
Yes.
Okay.
it's on.
No, that is a good question. It's a hard question, and I don't know if we have great evidence on it. I don't know if we have great evidence on it from Indonesia. I think the question is that, you know, so let's take a step back. In high-income countries, you provide a lot of the social insurance through work. So, for example, when I get my paycheck, the government takes a certain amount out for the pension, and then it's all done through formal employers. The health insurance is often done through formal employers. And I think that, and for many countries struggle with the fact of if you set up systems where you provide insurance for formal workers through firms, you do insurance for informal workers separately. If the government is subsidizing it or doing it differently for informal workers, that there would be a move from formal workers into informality. And that is a key challenge that you see in many different countries, and I don't think we have the world's greatest evidence on how to solve it. And so some countries I'll add one more thing. So some countries try to solve it by providing social insurance universally. So for example, Thailand is one of them where the health insurance was done universally and not just through workplace insurance to try to minimize these effects. And has been shown to be effective in reducing mortality, infant mortality and such. And so there's some countries in Latin America as well that based on how you design the incentives, like maybe you make the formal one better so that people have an incentive, or things that people want, so you make the formal one better so that it promotes formality. You know, so there is some evidence like that out there in terms of design, but I think there's just a lot more that we can study and do because this is a problem that every country is grappling with.
Thank you so much, Prof. Rima. Actually, there's a follow-up question, but I think you already answered like how actually creating like blanket for formal and informal. So the follow-up is like how to communicate. But I think like you answered that questions on about the formality and informality on social protections.
Yeah.
Ibu Sekar. Faster. I am faster.
Yeah, I was about to like run over there. Hey, Rima. I think we met in 2017. I was at NC State. I think you had a tree seminar, the Duke, NC State, and RTI International, Raleigh, Durham. You talk about the elimination of 3-in-1 policy in Jakarta. Yeah. So yeah, I was like, oh, okay. So that's good. Yeah, I'm actually doing macroeconomics, and you're like, what is she doing here? But I also do care about social protection, poor household, and everything like that. That's like the biggest misconception, I think. So I do a lot of macroeconomics and environmental economics as well. So recently, I know you talk a lot about subsidies, right? That the fuel subsidy is one of them. I think that's your earlier research is about the fuel subsidy in Indonesia. We found that this is very interesting because it's not only regressive, but it's also inflationary. The fuel subsidy itself. If you think about it, that's like counterintuitive because you want to subsidize fuel to, limit the effect of inflation from the oil price, the world oil price, for example. But we found that there's this regime of inflation. So higher headline inflation is actually caused by administered price inflation. So once the government increased the domestic fuel price by 30%, 50%, that causes a very high increase, a high jump in headline inflation, and also very persistent. So we think that that's also affecting the inflation expectation. So it doesn't matter how much money you give to the poor people if the government still have that problem of increasing the administered price, due to some like low fiscal space or whatever it is, then, we would still have that problem where poor people cannot actually buy things because it's so expensive due to the inflation. And it's very unfortunate because that's given the the nature of price dynamic, which is like rigid downward. Once it's go up, it's so difficult for it to actually fall. What do you think? Like, so the sensible advice to the government would be price deregulation, right? So you let everything, the domestic fuel price, to adjust to the international prices. But how do we go about protecting the affected communities and poor people? I know that you have we can give cash transfer, for example. I think Pertamina had this application where you can apply to that such things, but that created a lot of controversy because not all poor people are digitized, for example. Or should we just forget about it, forget all of the targeted cash transfer due to the price deregulation, and just create a better social protection in general that can cope to such a shock in world oil price?
No, this is a good question. I mean, part of why, when the fuel subsidy is, cutting the fuel subsidy, part of it, and letting it float, you worry about inflation. I mean, that's the issue. That's why you do cash transfers, because things are more expensive for the poor, for everybody, because things will go up in price, and that's why it's not a very popular policy to cut. But what you end up doing is you spend the money that you would have spent on the subsidy, and you really concentrate it on the poor to try to give them then more purchasing power. So then the question is, how do you balance that to make sure that you get it right? And that's not a very easy thing to do, and it's very controversial in many countries. And so I think it basically comes down to the design of these programs and making sure that you get it right. But then I think there's the inflationary pressures from that, but then there's also, as you said, there's, prices change all the time. Certain types of food prices change. It's not just fuel, things are changing over time, and you have a limited budget available. You want to be thinking about when there are economic downturns or where things are getting more expensive, how do you increase social protection then? But you can't keep it high indefinitely because you might not have the money to do so. So in good times, you're trying to bring it back down again. And so creating these more flexible kind of systems and automatic stabilizers and all of that, I think, are sort of the next thing that we need to be thinking about. But due to the nature of how hard it is to design these systems when you have limited information, they tend to be very fixed. And they aren't as reactive as they could be. But so I agree with you. I mean, you want to be thinking about how you can make them much more reactive to macro conditions.
Thank you, Bu Sekar, for the question and the answer, Prof. Rima. Anyone from the floor, or I should go?
Oh.
Wait, Pak Gumilang.
Okay, thank you for the great presentation. I would like to ask, in relevance to gig economy, which produces a lot of short-term contracts workers, for example, like freelancers, how do you think is their social protection in the future? Thank you.
Sorry, for which kind of work? Sorry, I couldn't hear super well. For which kind of workers?
Can you repeat,
Freelancers.
Freelancers that is produced because of the gig economy.
Gig economy.
Yeah.
Gojek, Grab.
Yeah, no, so that is another, this is another challenge as we start thinking about, this is another challenge as well about when we start thinking about informal workers. How do we start handling the gig economy? And we see this, and this has been again, I'm paralleling high and low and middle income countries just so we show that this is a challenge that is universal. As well is that there's a lot of debate, for example, in the US over the gig workers. Are they full-time workers or not? Oftentimes they don't get benefits in the way that formal employed workers do, and there's a lot of controversy around it. And I think this answer of how as the gig worker economy is taking off, I think this is a large challenge for many countries, and it speaks more of why we need these more flexible systems that can handle that. But I don't think we've got it fully solved. There's a lot of work to do. Sorry, I know that's not a great answer for a lot of these things, but I think there is a lot of work to do.
that's absolutely good questions. Like I remember when I was
Yeah.
in Colorado, like the government like couldn't figure out how to subsidize the gig
Yeah.
worker. So what they did like give like $500 to make them stay at home during the first month of the COVID. So they like they're not moving around. So maybe like that's like the only solution because they don't like how to target or like how what to give to them.
Yeah.
So that's interesting question. Let's go to the Zoom because like we have Pak Bustanul Arifin questions. It's very good presentations. Thanks a lot. I believe some beneficiary, the poor, might receive for more than 2 social protection, like BPNT and PPKH or PKH, and then BPNT and PIP, Indonesia Pintar. In your RCT model, how to treat the beneficiary who have more than one social protection program, basically like accumulation or like
Yeah.
complementaries.
So I don't think it's a bad thing if people get more than one program. And I think what's kind of interesting, when we think of providing social assistance, what we'd like to do is, the people who are the poorest of the poor, we want to get them up higher, and so you want to give them a lot more. The people who might be at sort of the middle, you might want to give them some assistance, but they might not need as much as the poorest of the poor. But it's very difficult to figure out this person versus that person and to maybe give different amounts in different programs. So sometimes when we have programs with different cutoffs where the people at the bottom receive 4 programs and then you receive, higher up you receive, 2 programs or 1 program, it actually tries to sort of concentrate assistance more at the bottom. So I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. But again, that's something we can also try to think about and test more and understand more.
Yeah, actually, Pak Elan wrote with his student about the complementaries research, but we're still working on progress on that. Any questions from the floor? Pak Gilang.
Oh, Vishnu is very fast. He's been playing tennis, I guess. Thank you so much, Rima, for the presentation. It's more of a sharing, and perhaps we can get your thoughts. So we did a study inspired by your community-based targeting versus the PMT program. It was actually done after the Eid Fitr back in 2021 and just before the Delta. It was done in one particular district in Central Java. So the premise is that for community-based targeting, we would get more information on the dynamic welfare information of households in our community. So that's something that we want to test. And so we did a lab in the field experiment whereby we asked them to rank households based on their consumption per capita and their neediness as well as their assets. And at the same time, we also do surveys, to get to know their consumption, to get to know their assets and stuff like that. And third, we also do a community ranking mechanism whereby you invite people and then let's rank these households based on their assets, based on their consumptions. And what's interesting is that the community information that they have is actually more correlated on their long-term assets rather than their shorter-term welfare information. So I think it provides information that if a particular households get a shock, they lose their jobs or someone died, particularly during the COVID-19, the community-based target may not be doing a good job rather than other mechanisms. So that's what we found, and be good to get your thoughts.
Oh, that's super interesting. One of the things I learned in the community targeting is that it also, and maybe this explains more of it, so I'd like to learn more about, we should talk more about what you did, is that it's how you frame it. So when we were at the beginning saying like looking for the poor, I think people also think assets, and then when you start talking about other things of what could poverty be, so we gave them like a broader definition of, think broadly about poverty, and then had people brainstorm on that. So it could also be that, again, it goes back to these questions, is how you design these things actually really matters a lot. But I'm happy to talk more because I'm curious, that's super interesting. I'm curious to see the structure of how the information was elicited and whether or not, that's be interesting to actually test. Does the structure of how you elicit the information lead to different types of information of what the community thinks they should be communicating? So that would be super interesting, actually.
Yeah, thank you
that's
for
super
the
interesting.
great questions and great answers, Prof. Rima. Anyone from the floor, or like we should go back to the Zoom? I think we have like one question from the Zoom. From Emil Carmila. Many research show the critical roles of political leaders at the local level is controlling informations that people could receive for their favor. How the program design tested in your study address the issue of information capture at the local level, basically the political capture, elite political capture
In the community?
in the community. Yep.
Oh, yeah, so I didn't talk about the results so much, but actually what we realized is, at least in the case of Indonesia and the study we looked at, we saw very little elite capture. It was happening. So there was different types of things. There was just loss, there were leakages, across the board. But in terms of determining who should get it, what we realized is that there was very little elite capture. It was happening, but it was very small. And it was not large relative to, for example, if you fixed errors in how you collected the data. So in some ways, you know, the elite capture is there. So you could spend a lot of effort trying to get rid of it, or you could spend more of your effort fixing the data quality, and that might have actually improved it more. So it's not to say that these things don't matter. It's just trying to think about if you have limited time to try to, what can you do to improve the program the most? The data quality, I think, was actually a bigger issue.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof. Ima. Who is raising hand? Yep, please. I think no. They are like not speed up. Doesn't want to lose with my speed.
Thank you for the chance. And thank you for the seminar, Prof. Remahana. And I saw your webinars back in 2021 or 2022 about Kartu Prakerja. And about this social protection, have you ever considered to evaluate the targeted regions, especially in terms of how their rice market may be disrupted because of in-kind or Raskin subsidies? And I think it can be beneficial for further policy to change the subsidy to cash transfer only or other kind of sembako. So the rice market will not disrupt it, or else they will find other commodities to plant, and social protection may not run forever.
You know, I'm going to say something controversial. I think social protection kind of needs to run forever. No, I'm totally serious here. Like, you know, you see this, as countries get richer, they spend a greater share of their GDP per capita on social protection, on social insurance, on programs for the poor, than countries that are more lower and middle income, that have more poor people. Yeah. And I think what ends up happening is that, look, what ends up happening is that there are people who are going to need help no matter what. People who might be disabled and can't work. People who, for many different reasons, might be working and not earning enough money to live. We know that growth leads to higher inequality, and that inequality can be persistent across generations, and we might want to redistribute a bit. So I'm going to say something controversial of that. I do think social assistance is always going to exist and needs to be really developed if we want society to function. I do think it needs to be flexible, that just because social assistance always exists, there's some people who are always going to need it. If I'm a person with disabilities and I can't work, society might need to help support me, indefinitely. But I think social assistance can also be something where it's flexible. I've lost my job, and I get assistance at a time, and then I find a job again. I might not need assistance right now. There's a lot of different factors in play about how we make sure that it functions in a way that everybody is protected and not left behind, and that we try to do what we can to give kids an equal level playing field when we know that inequality exists in the world. So again, it might be a controversial remark, but that's
Yep.
at least my view.
Thank you so much. I think I'm agree with you. I discussed in the class, at some point, we are shifting from absolute poverty targeting to maybe relative poverty, right? It's not like people hungry anymore, but they still need help because they're at the bottom part. So yeah, so I can agree. It's not controversial.
It is for some.
For some, maybe, yeah. Okay, maybe one last questions because we have 5 minutes left before we closing down. Okay, that's the questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Rima, for the easy to digest presentation, because apparently, actually, I'm not a researcher in macroeconomics. And I just finished my study in innovation management in Imperial College London. And now I'm as an industry player, so I have a startup in aquaculture. But this is something that is very, very eye-opening for me, because as for now, we've been doing a lot of work with the government, and social protection, social assistance is the main programs that they do, especially in sector-based programs such as aquaculture, agriculture. And I was so inspired by your study in your slides that said changing what you give, because now the in-kind programs are usually what they do to help farmers or even like the sectoral workers. But now that you present new voucher program is actually something that, okay, they can work on that, and that I think that's like a fantastic idea to like implement social protection. And also you say that it's letting the private agents to be one of like the agents that deploy the protection programs, or like the help and the assistance. So based on what your research or what you found, is that how do you think, or like what's the main factor, the biggest factor that can make this voucher program or like more privatized program to be more successful in the future? Because like this is actually a good thing, because letting more private parties to be in the government program is something that's necessary. But again, there's a lot of risks in letting like the private agents to be in the program. So what do you think can be helped for other sectors, or like for this kind of programs to, be more open and be more successful in creating this, this kind of social protection for other sectors in developing countries like Indonesia? Thank you.
No, this is a good question. That would be very, very long to answer. But let me maybe give a quickie answer. I think, at the end of the day, this is why we invest in infrastructure. The infrastructure and the architecture of these programs. That the main innovation you have in terms of being able to give out these cash transfers or having these voucher type programs is the infrastructure of the banking system. And investing in that, and how that leads to being able to more effectively give out transfers. And so that's, for example, one thing that's important. Another thing that is important is IDs. For a lot of countries, around the world, they're struggling with these kind of programs because they don't have a national ID number, and they're trying to get these registries in place for to have ID system card has been a big innovation in the last years. For example, like you look at India, where now everybody has an Aadhaar number and there's a bank account attached to it, and that's been a way to be able to give out transfers more effectively. So I do think that there's thinking through the kind of structures in place you need and sort of the supporting infrastructure is really important as we think about the design of the programs, because what we can imagine or to brainstorm and think outside the box really also depends on the more mundane things of infrastructure building.
Thank you so much, Prof. Rima, for the answer. I think we can close our Q&A session. So maybe like next time when you visit again to UGM, someone can ask further questions. So I think we can end the session for today. And then thank you so much again for the presentation, for the answers, for enlightening us in UGM here. I think we can give the room back to Jessita. Thank you.
So please give round of applause. So as we come to the close of this very enlightening seminar, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude for our esteemed guest speaker, Professor Rima Hanna, for sharing her insights and expertise with us today. I also would like to thank our moderator, Pak Wisnu Setiadi Nugroho, PhD, for skillfully guiding through our discussions and keeping us engaged throughout the session. So lastly, we also like to thank all of the participants and guests. Your presence and active participation have made this seminar a success. So let us carry the knowledge and inspiration gained today to further advance the cause of social protection in developing country. Thank you and have a wonderful day ahead, and see you on the next Sinarku session. Thank you very much.